Who decides who you are? One side says identity is self-determined. Another says identity must be verified externally. If identity has to be invented, it depends on four things. It depends on feelings, it depends on experiences, it depends on cultural input and social influence. Now the problem here is all of these things, they change, and they change constantly. So what happens then? In this scenario, you redefine and you redefine and you redefine again. Here's what we are seeing today. We see identity categories expanding. Gender categories are changing rapidly. Definitions are also changing rapidly. And you have constant reinterpretation. Now, this is not accidental. This is purely a logical outcome of adhering to a worldview or living with a worldview with no fixed reference point. There are moments in history when societies argue about policies, and there are moments when societies argue about people. Every so often, a society argues about something deeper, what we should do, and not what is legal, but what a human being actually is. And I believe we are living in one of those moments, because the debates around gender, identity, self-identification, rights, they all feel immediate, they all feel emotional and urgent. But underneath all of that is a deeper question. Who decides who you are? Or who decides who we are? Welcome to Let's Reason Together. I am your host, Vishal Abraham. And in this episode, we're going to look at a very important issue or a very important topic, which is about gender identity. On the 13th of March, 2026, a few weeks back, Social Justice Minister Virendra Kumar introduced the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Amendment Bill. Now, the amendment proposes a few things, which is removing the right to self-perceived gender identity, which means a person cannot identify themselves, by themselves, that they belong to a particular gender category. It now requires certification from a medical board. And the bill also aims to redefine what qualifies as transgender. Now, we have to contrast this with the NALSA versus Union of India Supreme Court judgment, which affirmed a very key thing. That is a person's right to self-identify. That means I can define who I am based on how I feel. So here's the clash. One side says identity is self-determined. Another says identity must be verified externally. And both sides are arguing strongly. But here's what I want to suggest. Both sides are answering a deeper question without actually addressing it. Now, before we decide who decides our identity, we need to answer something more fundamental. And that is, what is a human being? Because our answer to that question will determine everything else. And this is where most conversations stop too early. We tend to jump to conclusions without examining foundations. So let's slow down, as we always do, and think through this. Now, let's begin with something simple. Let's look at this logically. When we were conceived, when we were an embryo or a zygote or a fetus, we had no awareness. We had no sense of self. We had no ability to choose. We had no consciousness. And yet, our DNA was formed. Our biological sex was determined. Our development began. Now, we didn't choose any of this. So here's my question to you. If we did not choose ourselves, then where did we come from? And now we enter the territory that most people avoid, because this is no longer biology. This is about something called a worldview. Now, what is a worldview? And answering this is very important when we move forward in this. A worldview is not just a belief system. It is the lens through which we interpret reality. It is a system through which we understand and live our life. There are many worldviews in the world that we live in, from atheism, agnosticism, anti-theism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, materialism, and so on. In one way or another, we all subscribe to some sort of a worldview. That is, every person believes in some form of a system to understand the world. Every person believes in something. But the question is now, how do we know which one is correct? And the answer is not that simple. But In a basic sense, a worldview must answer four fundamental questions. And this was explained and articulated by one of the late Christian apologists, Dr. Ravi Zacharias. He said it must answer four key questions. It must answer the questions of origin, of meaning, of morality, and destiny. Origin, which means where do I come from? Meaning, why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? Morality, what is right and wrong and how do we define? And destiny, where am I headed? And here's the key thing. Any worldview that you subscribe to must answer all four questions consistently, must also be coherent, and it has to correspond to lived reality. It cannot contradict itself. Now, after all these years, I personally have come to the conclusion, after careful consideration and examination, that the Christian or the Judeo-Christian worldview does answer all these questions in a coherent manner, in a consistent manner. It corresponds to reality that we live in, and it is empirically verifiable across multiple spheres of studies and life. Now, you are free to disagree with me and form your own conclusion, because convictions take time. It's a matter of personal choice. But all these things need to be examined. The reasons for my belief and how to choose a worldview is something we will discuss in detail in the coming seasons. So, if I have to answer anything, we have to look through a particular lens, right? You have to have a perspective. So I'm going to explain the question of gender identity through the Christian worldview, and also first compare it with the most famous of worldviews, the atheistic worldview, because you have to have a contrast in understanding things. Now, we're all familiar with atheism. In this framework, there is no creator, no starter, no designer. There is no intentional origin. Atheism says you and I are the product of time plus matter plus chance. What does that mean? It means you and I are not designed. There is no intention behind us. You are not authored. You and I, we simply appeared purely by accident. Now, follow this carefully with me. If that is true, let's put it to the test of logic. If that is true, there is no given identity. In that scenario, what must we do? We have to create ourselves, and that sounds empowering. But let's examine that for a moment. If you and I are a product of chance, time plus matter plus chance, then our brain is also a product of chance. Our reasoning is a product of chance. Our feelings are a product of chance. So now the question becomes, can we trust our own conclusions? Because the very tool we are using to define ourselves is itself accidental. Now, this creates a loop. We are, in essence, using an unreliable system to define our identity. Now, let's apply this to the question of gender identity and so on. If identity has to be invented, it depends on four things. It depends on feelings, it depends on experiences, it depends on cultural input and social influence. Now, the problem here is all of these things, they change, and they change constantly. So what happens then? Identity becomes unstable because opinions change, people's perceptions change. My feelings that I have today may not be the same 20 years down the line. I might feel something. And as an example, I might say, I am a woman trapped in a man's body. I might feel that way right now because of very real reasons. But what if that changes 30 years down the line? In this scenario, you redefine, and you redefine, and you redefine again. Here's what we are seeing today. We see identity categories expanding. Gender categories are changing rapidly. Definitions are also changing rapidly. And you have constant reinterpretation. Now, this is not accidental. This is purely a logical outcome of adhering to a worldview or living with a worldview with no fixed reference point. Now, let's consider another possibility. Think about this. What if you and I, we are not an accident? What if we are created? Now, everything changes. Because if there is a creator, this means there is intention, there is design, there is meaning. And here's the key. Identity is not invented. It is given. To bring this home, let's look at an example. Think of a painting. Many famous paintings have been there for many years, thousands of years. We can analyze it endlessly. Art enthusiasts, experts, scientists, historians, we can analyze it, we can dissect it, we can interpret it many, many different times. I might have one interpretation of the painting, another person might have a different one. But you know what? Unless you know the artist's original intention, you and I are guessing. It's the same with a product. Only the person who designed it knows its true purpose and what it is meant to be and how it has to be used. That's why we used to get product manuals. In many cases, we still do get it. Or we may misuse the product. Now, we are all familiar with the famous classic movie called The Godfather. In many scenes, the director used oranges. One famous scene, in the introduction of The Godfather, Marlon Brando, in that scene, you have a bowl of oranges kept on a top shelf on his right side. And once the movie became a classic, volumes of books were written about the meaning of the oranges. It signified danger, it signified death, it signified so many different things. Volumes of books and interpretations were written. Film students studied this. But you know what the problem? After a long time, when a group of interviewers finally caught up with Gordon Willis, the cinematographer, he said, there's no symbolic meaning interpreted. We kept it to give a visual balance to a rather dark and brown visual palette. But interpretations were multiple. People were free to interpret it, give meaning to it how they viewed it. But no one asked the creator, or in this case, the actual guy who did it, and who said there was no symbolism intended. So what we are looking at is we can derive meaning from anything if we really want to. If we take the original intention out of it, anything goes. Now, I'm going to make my position clear. I'm going to analyze identity, and like I said earlier, I need some sort of a framework. And for this, I'm going to use a Christian worldview because, as we have said, as far as I'm concerned, and the studies I've done, it answers origin, meaning, morality, destiny with coherence and consistency. Again, like I said earlier, feel free to disagree, and I would love to hear opinions on this. But I encourage you, don't dismiss it. Let's examine it. Now, in the Christian worldview, many are familiar with it. In the book of Genesis, in chapter 1, 26 and 27, it says, God created man in his image, male and female. Now, this tells us identity is not self-generated. It is rooted in creation. It includes something called embodiment. Being made in God's image, that is imago Dei, it means you have inherent worth. You have inherent purpose. You are designed. You are not random. You and I are not accidental. We were created with intention. Now, I am an author, and I write a lot of different things, from short stories to articles to poems and so on and so forth. It is a prerogative of the creator. As a creator, I give meaning to what I write. I tell a story, and if it is a poem, I sometimes layer it with meanings, and anybody who reads it can have multiple interpretations of it. But unless you ask me, that meaning can be anything. And exactly what is happening here. You and I have been created by an intelligent designer, and we have been imbued purpose and meaning. Now, Genesis 3 explains something very crucial. It explains why we feel misaligned. Because now, our desires can conflict with design. Our feelings can distort truth. So, feeling something deeply does not make it ultimately true. So now we return to the question, can we self-identify? Now here's my answer. Identity is not invented. It is received and then it is discovered. So let me leave you with this. If you remove the possibility of a creator, you are left to define yourself endlessly. But if there is a creator, then the question is, who do I want to be? The question becomes, who was I created to be? And that's a very important question, and that changes everything. We have to acknowledge at some point that we have been created with purpose, with meaning. Otherwise, debates can go on endlessly. Policies will not change. It will not address issues. Now, before we end this, let me also say something very important. Those who struggle with real issues like gender dysphoria, they struggle with something very, very important, and nobody can dismiss that. And in many studies, it has been shown that many times people who struggle with it have a misaligned perspective on how they're viewing life. The outcome should be, or the way that we should approach it, should be guided by compassion and help them through this. It's not as simple as saying that, hey, this feeling is just a feeling, remove it, and everything will be okay. But what they're feeling or what they're going through is extremely real. And that suffering is real, and that confusion is real, and that anxiety and worry that comes with it are also real. And I think it's time that we step up to understand what the issues that they're going through and have conversations and help them to see how biology, how a fixed reference point, how all these things are hardwired into our being, and how that can that actually gives meaning to who we are. Our identity, and we have to remember this, is not something we invent. Because, like I was saying earlier, if we have to invent it, we will have to continuously maintain that, sustain it, perform it, and then if our feelings change, we'll have to redefine it. And that's a hard task. We agree, or if we accept the fact that before anything, yours and mine, our identity are given to us, then it takes a large burden off our shoulders. We only need to discover that and live that out. And that changes everything. Now, if you found this useful, please do share it with someone who's struggling with these issues so that we can have a conversation and let them start seeing things from a different perspective. And until we meet in the next episode, this is Vishal Abraham, always encouraging you to question, to think, and believe.